of all hostages, surge humanitarian assistance to Gaza, and set the conditions for an end to the war. He announced an additional $404 million in humanitarian assistance to Gaza, bringing the total U.S. contribution since October 7th to more than $674 million, making the U.S. the largest contributor of humanitarian assistance to the Palestinian people in the world. He also continued conversations with countries in the region about the day after the conflict and how we can work together to establish effective governance, security, and reconstruction in Gaza. As the Secretary said at a news conference in Doha yesterday, that work is key to turning a ceasefire into an end to the conflict, turning the end of the conflict into enduring peace, and using that peace as a foundation for a more stable, prosperous region. The Secretary then traveled to Italy last night, where he is joining President Biden to continue to work on issues related to the conflict in Gaza, as well as other challenges facing the world. He will be there through the end of the week. And with that, go to questions. No AP, so start with. And I'll also note at the top, I may have to wrap slightly shorter than usual today, so I'm not out here when the president begins speaking in Italy. So
okay, yeah.
Go ahead.
For that, Matt. Welcome back.
Yeah.
I'd like to ask first on Evan Gershkovich and he's being charged with espionage, including working for the CIA and going now on trial. Is there any? What is your reaction? Is there any credibility to the charges in your understanding? How do you see it playing out?
No, there's absolutely zero credibility to those charges. We have been clear from the start that Evan has done nothing wrong. He should never have been arrested in the first place. Journalism is not a crime. The charges against him are false, and the Russian government knows that they are false. He should be released immediately. And I can tell you that on behalf of the United States government, we will continue to work to bring home Evan Gershkovich and Paul Whelan every day. It's something that we are constantly working on and constantly pursuing.
Can I follow up on Evan?
Yeah.
Thanks, Matt. Are you concerned at all for his safety as he is transferred from Moscow to Ekaterinburg? And Roger Carson said you guys may lose contact with him during that time.
I don't have any specific concerns to mention here, but I will say we are in contact with Evan. We've been in contact with him. We've had consular visits with him regularly. The last one we had was in May. We will continue to seek consular access to him. It's something that we have demanded from the Russian government and continue to push for. And part of the reason we do that is so we can regularly check on his safety and his well-being, and that's what we'll continue to do.
And do you see this as any sign, either positive or negative, for negotiations to secure his release? In the past, we have seen these negotiations sort of stall until there has been a trial. So how do you read that?
I just don't want to kind of speculate one way or the other about what the impact of these could be. We're going to continue to try to pursue his release. We put a substantial offer on the table to secure the release of Evan and Paul Whelan some months ago. As we said publicly, we're continuing to work to secure their release. We don't talk about all the details of that publicly. This has always been the case, but it is one of the Secretary and the President's highest priorities.
Come to Gaza.
Yeah.
So the Secretary, during his trip, talked about in coming weeks, the U.S. will put forward proposals for the day after the conflict in Gaza. So just to try to, I know obviously it's not coming weeks just yet, but to understand what that will be, what that might look like. Is this is something that you're planning to put forward in detail whether or not there's a ceasefire agreement in the meantime?
I don't want to get ahead of I don't want to get any further than what the Secretary said yesterday. We are continuing to have conversations with our partners in the region about what exactly those plans will look like. We had those on this trip. As you know, it's something we've been working on really in earnest since January, a number of complicated issues to work through. Obviously, the best environment to kind of launch those proposals would be if we had a ceasefire, because once you have a ceasefire, that's something that we want to turn into something more enduring. But where we might be several weeks from now, it's very hard to speculate, because as you know, we've been trying to get a ceasefire for some time, and we don't have one yet. We're continuing to push for one. But I think the point the Secretary was trying to make is we don't want to let the absence of a ceasefire stop us from pursuing that work on reconstruction, on security and governance, because it's important that we nail down the details and with our partners in the region that we've been working with, and it's important that we are ready to seize any opportunity to make sure that should we achieve a ceasefire, we can turn that into something more meaningful and enduring and lasting.
And is there a plan that regional countries have signed up to? Is it the Israelis who are left to convince? This something that you're going to put forward in order to get them on board? Is that sort of...
I just don't want to speak to it in any more detail. These are conversations that continue at a diplomatic level. The Secretary has been engaged in them. Assistant Secretary Leaf has been engaged in them with her counterparts and will continue over the next few weeks.
And I'm sure other people will have questions on this, but just on Israeli operations in Rafah, there's reporting that they've sort of gone deeper into the city, reaching the beach. I think the Israeli military themselves said they struck 45 targets over the past day. Does this constitute the full-scale operation that you've been warning about?
It continues to be something we're watching incredibly closely, but we still have not yet seen them launch what looks like a full-scale major military operation. Certainly not in the size, scope, or scale of the operations in Khan Yunis, in Gaza City, elsewhere in Gaza. It's been a more limited operation, which is not to say it hasn't had a dramatic impact on the population there. Of course it has. We've seen hundreds of thousands of people, maybe a million or a little more than a million people who have left Rafah and fled west and fled north, and we continue to work to try to get humanitarian assistance to those people. But just in terms of the operation itself, it does still look like somewhat of a different operation than the kind that we had seen previously and that we had warned very much against publicly and in direct conversations with the Israeli government.
Thank you. Could you talk a little bit more about these Hamas wanting these written guarantees from the US? Do you see this as in any way reasonable or outrageous? Have they done this before? Is there anything you can give us?
I cannot talk any more about that, as you might imagine. We're not going to talk at all about the details of the response that Hamas got, at least in terms of what is contained in that in that response. I've seen a lot of reporting about it. Not all of it has been accurate. I wouldn't characterize any further than what the Secretary said yesterday.
What hasn't been accurate?
Nice try.
Can
No,
I just
I'll
ask
come to you, Said. Don't
just one on the-
Said, I'll always come to you. So go ahead.
Open-ended question. The pier is set to be dismantled again due to sea state. Do you have any comment on that?
I would defer to my colleagues at the Pentagon who are responsible for the operation of the pier. Do you have anything else, Jenny?
Yeah, I just wanted to know if there's been any contact through the mediators with Hamas since they submitted their proposal the other night. When do you expect there to be any contact? There's some reporting that the Israelis aren't going to participate in further negotiations.
I will let the mediators speak to that. Obviously, we were in contact on what day is it? Thursday. On Tuesday night with the Egyptian mediators, and the Secretary spoke directly with the Qatari mediator, the Prime Minister, yesterday in his meeting in Doha. They, as I think you know, tend to be in fairly regular contact with the political wing of Hamas. But in terms of what the next step of negotiations will look like, I don't want to get into that from here, other than to say that we are committed to trying to push forward to get a ceasefire. We were disappointed with the response that came back from Hamas yesterday. As the Secretary said, as you've heard some other people say, there were some suggested changes that were fairly minor and were fairly workable, and then there were some that we don't see as workable. But that said, we're committed to trying to push forward and get a ceasefire because we continue to believe it is in the interests of all involved parties.
You were disappointed, but were you surprised that they came back with these changes? I mean, given that Netanyahu didn't ever publicly commit to this, I know the U.S. says that Israel has been on board, but
I personally doubt that comments or lack of comments from the Israeli government had anything to do with the substance of the Hamas response. I think the substance of I'm not going to characterize why they might have submitted the response that they did. So we were disappointed both that it took so long to get a response and that the response had a number of changes that could drag the negotiations out further. As you heard the Secretary say yesterday, getting a ceasefire is urgent. There are people that are suffering every day. There are Palestinians who are dying every day as a result of this conflict. There are hostages that continue to be held. You see the conflict in the north of Israel continue to reach concerning levels, and we want to tackle all of those issues, and the best way to do that is through a ceasefire, and that's why we'll continue to pursue it, and we want it to happen without delay. Saeed.
Thank you. Matt, welcome back.
Thank
we
you.
missed you. So a couple of
exciting.
questions that follow up on Simon and Kamala. First of all, on the talks itself, you said that the Hamas's response was late in coming, but the resolution at the Security Council was on Monday. The response was on Tuesday, almost like 24 hours and so on.
I don't think the clock started with the UN Security Council resolution. It started with the
So
proposal being delivered to them, which was 12 days before their
okay,
response.
on the issue of the response now, we're a bit confused because the National Security Advisor, Mr. Sullivan, said actually they were minor. You know, most of in fact, all the suggestions by Hamas or the amendments were quite workable, quite doable. Now we heard something different.
That is not what he said, but go ahead.
Okay.
He said a number of them were minor, some were
Okay,
problematic.
Well, that's my question actually. But the secretary said that there are some workable and some are not workable. Can you share with us some of these things that are not workable, for instance?
No, I cannot. I'm not going to get into the details of that from here. I think it's appropriate to conduct a public negotiation. But as the secretary said, there are a number of things that Hamas suggested in this response that go further than they had agreed to in previous iterations. As you know, there have been proposals that go back and forth, and as the secretary said, usually in a negotiation, if a party agrees to something in one stage of the negotiation, they don't then make a more or a less reasonable demand later on in the process. So all that said, we'll continue to push to try to get a resolution because we think it's in the interest of all the Palestinian people and the Israeli people.
So as far as I know, there's been no official Israeli response. But you guys keep saying that Israel agreed to this. Yet we have not heard from the prime minister. We have not heard from any senior official saying, yeah, we accept or reject, for whatever. There's been no response.
So,
there are reports, Israeli media reports, that say that the prime minister did not even share the document with many of his ministers, and that's, like Ben Gvir or Smotrich and so on. Do you have any comment on that? If the Israelis have not responded, why are they taking so long to respond to something that initially was their proposal?
Why are they taking a long time? The Israeli government does not need to respond to its own proposal. It's their proposal. But in terms of support, for this, to be clear, in terms of support for that proposal, two things. Number one, it's not true that the Israeli government hasn't come out and said it was their proposal and they supported. They did do that. They did that in the days immediately after. There were advisors to the prime minister that came out and said that publicly. Number two, the secretary discussed this directly with the prime minister himself on Tuesday when we were in Israel, and the prime minister reaffirmed his support for the proposal. So it's
In an
simply
official
not true.
statement, did he support it?
In a direct conversation with, but in a direct conversation with the secretary laid publicly. But Saeed, again, there are officials from the Israeli government who have come out and said that as well.
Okay, but then clear it for us, because at least I'm confused on the issue of the first phase and the second phase and so on. It seems that the Israelis, in all their statements, they focus on the first phase, but not on the transitional second phase, and on, let's say, allowing all the stuff that is in the second phase and the third phase. So could you explain to us where, is this the sticking point, for instance, between the Palestinians and the Israelis?
So I'm not going to get into what the various sticking points are in the proposal. When it comes to statements made by the Israeli government, I'm just going to look at what the Israeli government has done.
Right.
And that they put forward this proposal that the president outlined 13 days ago that would lead to an immediate ceasefire, that would lead to an extended ceasefire as negotiations moved from phase 1 to phase 2, and that ultimately could bring about an end to the war. And one of the points that the secretary was getting to yesterday, it's really important that in that proposal that the president outlined, that the ceasefire doesn't end in 6 weeks. There's a six-week ceasefire that continues when negotiations continue. And so Hamas could have agreed to that proposal, didn't lock them in long term. There's an agreement. There would be continued negotiations at the end of 6 weeks. Those negotiations actually start in 16 days, and the ceasefire continued. But at least we would have had a ceasefire. At least we would have had a halt to the suffering. And Hamas didn't do that. Instead, they dragged it out for 12 days, and now there will be continued haggling and a delay in the ceasefire, and that's what we were disappointed in. But as I said, we are committed to continue to work on this because it is so vitally important to the people in the region. Okay,
just a couple of follow-up. There's been a UN report detailing Israeli war crimes during the first month of the war. Have you seen the report?
We saw that the report was released today, and we're reviewing it now.
Okay, so you don't have any comment on that?
Other than that, we are looking at it.
And lastly, on last Saturday's raid, now there's been more than 276 Palestinians were killed, in Jabalia. So, and I know that the U.S. government, the Western government, congratulated Israel on freeing 4 hostages. But then we had 276 Palestinian civilians, mainly civilians, and 600 others wounded. How do you respond to this kind of enormous death toll?
So the secretary actually spoke to this the last couple of days while he was in the region, and I'll just echo what he said, which is our condolences go out to any innocent civilian that was killed or injured in this operation. We don't want to see any civilian die in this operation. That's one of the reasons why we're pushing for a ceasefire, is to stop the suffering that is happening every day in Gaza. If you look at the circumstances of this raid, there are a couple things that are clear. Number one, Israel